All right, good evening. I'm going to be talking about some Canadian military history today, specifically explaining the improvement in performance of the Canadian Corps in the battles of 1917 and 1918, vice 1915 and 1916. So, some sources I'll be using for this will be Bill Rawlings' book, Surviving Trench Warfare, Mark Humphrey's article, um, The Myth of the Learning Curve, uh, Andrew Godfrey's article, A Lesson in Success, about the Colon Trench Raid from January 1917, and that was 2nd Div, I think 4th Brigade. Cook's article, A Proper Slaughter, about the Vimy gas raid in March 1917, and I believe that was 2nd Div. The 2nd Canadian Division, I believe. No. That was the 3rd Canadian Division, 8th Brigade. Tim Cook's book, No Place to Run. Shane Schreiber's book, The Shock Army of the British Empire. Doug Delaney's article, Mentoring the Canadian Corps. Peter Simkin's article, Co-Stars or Supporting Cast. I think there's something else mixed in there, but we'll get there when we get there. Okay, so I have a very simple explanation to why the Canadian Corps did so well in 1917 and 1918, and it was simply that you had better equipment and professionals who knew how to use said equipment. Now, this sounds like an obvious answer, but it is not. If you look through the historiography, you'll find a lot of conventional explanations that have to do with, or I shouldn't say conventional, but the conventional, traditional explanation seems to center on two things. The first thing is doctrine. We really like to talk about doctrine. As historians, I feel it's because it's easy. It's all written down. It's very easy to analyze. You can get the PAMs. You can look at the PAMs. You can look at the say reports, after action reports, and say, and you can kind of look at the secondary sources and say, aha, especially if you have pre-existing ones like an official history, and say, aha, they changed what they said from this, what they're going to do from this to that, and it was successful here and not successful there, ergo the changes from here to there. There's an oversimplification of how many historians make the argument, but it still has some truth in it. We often forget that doctrine's carried out by people, or not carried out by people. Anyway, also, I have to say this, on a soldier level, doctrine, you would consider doctrine, often are like low levels SOPs that don't necessarily make it up, right? They don't necessarily make it up all the way to the top. Everyone does stuff a little bit differently. So unless you're going to find every set of orders given by every platoon, given by every company, they might have done things differently, and that doing something differently might have affected the outcome of the battle. So it's very difficult to make that epistemological link from a change in doctrine, there we are, a change in doctrine to a specific outcome, or actually the way it looks on the screen. There we go, a change of out, left to right, yeah. It's very hard to make that link. At leadership, I won't get into it too deeply, but I think there's a bit of hero worship with Arthur Currie. He was a good general. There were a lot of good generals, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. There were a lot of bad ones, but there were also a lot of good ones. I mean, even if you're going to play up the colonial superman thing, if you ask your average Canadian first about Arthur Currie, they're going to say he commanded at Vimy Ridge, which he did not. And second, you could ask them, so who is John Monash? And they wouldn't have a clue. They probably wouldn't know who Julian Byng was. Canadians owe quite a bit to Julian Byng. Yes. So, it's not as obvious as it seems. So basically, I'm going to discuss a few things. We're going to discuss 3 subject headings, basically. First one are some of the conventional explanations. I'll just go over them. Second will be some of the refutations, which I think go too far. And then third, we'll have our nice synthesis. We'll have our thesis, antithesis. We'll have the wonderful synthesis where we're going to talk about people and professionalization. So, let's begin. Let's go with the, and of course, because I'm doing something, my computer's whining. Apologies. Let's go with conventional explanations. So, if you're looking at an improvement, if you're looking at talking about doctrine and improvements in doctrine and kind of assimilation of new doctrine that explains battlefield success, the best place to look is Bill Rawling. Now, I'm being an historian, so I'm being a nitpicker, but let's make it clear: Surviving Trench Warfare is actually a very good book. You should read it. But Rawling's point is that the Canadian Corps did well because it was able to kind of experiment, find new solutions to things, incorporate both doctrinal and technological changes, disseminate those changes throughout the Corps, and then execute them. Now, that has helped because the Canadian Corps kind of stayed together, right? And in this kind of, we'll call them the conventional explanations for the Canadian Corps' success. The kind of cohesiveness of the Canadian Corps plays a lot in there. Tim Cook mentions this in No Place to Run, where he talks about the formation of Canadian Gas Services. Canadians are able to better focus their they're able to draw on British doctrine, but then able to develop their own doctrine kind of internally within the Corps, playing on the experience of the various divisions, because the divisions weren't shifted around in and out of the Canadian Corps. Rawling talks about the emergence of managers and technicians as the term he uses, where the soldiers became technicians. So in terms of how to best to employ these new technical weapons, all the way down to the section level. And he talks about a learning curve and how it happened on every level. For example, changes in the section. By the end of the war, the rifles have gone from the primary means of killing to protecting the machine guns. And you have, within a section, you'll have like a rifle grenadier, a Lewis gunner, like a rifleman to protect those guys, ammo carriers, and so on, right? You have your own kind of little combined arms sub unit going on. Yeah, so those guys become technicians. Managers, they adopt a less heroic approach, a very managerial approach that lets them coordinate. For example, like everyone talks about the rolling barrage. Just as important as the rolling barrage were counter battery actions. So you're able to, for example, incorporate counter battery into that, which is a very technical thing, and coordinate fires and all that kind of noise. So the technicians become focused on survival, and the managers become focused on winning. If you look at Shane Schreiber, he talks about the shock army of the British Empire. So he's actually focusing on the battles in base from Hill 70 and throughout 1918. He doesn't talk about Vimy. So Schreiber makes a couple of interesting points. Similar to Rawling in that the self-contained nature of the Canadian Corps makes a difference. But he talks a little bit about how the Canadians weren't as sort of infected with conventional military mindset as British were, and you have guys like Arthur Currie who became more proficient through self-study. It's a good book. I don't agree. Doug Delaney talks about this. We borrowed a lot of staff officers from the British. And I mean, Currie, he was a very good general. He was very good, but he wasn't heads and shoulders above other generals. And Peter Simpkins, we'll mention this when we get to him. Towards the end of the war, he also had more resources. So, the Canadian Corps, one of its strengths was that it was able to operate kind of as part of the British Army. Anyway, it's a major problem with the book. Anytime we have hero worship, I get a little bit skeptical. Yep. So that's Shane Schreiber, Shock Army of the British Empire. He's talking a bit about that national bit there, um, and that leadership bit. Uh, right. Yeah, that's all I was going to talk about there. So if you're looking at the antithesis of that, we will talk about two authors, Mark Humphreys and Peter Simpkins. So, Mark Humphreys in The Myth of the Learning Curve. Actually, no, we'll start with Peter Simpkins. So, Peter Simpkins in co-stars with supporting cast, he does a really interesting bit where he takes those battles in the late war, and he kind of compares the Canadian and Australian successes by division. So he does it by divisions with British successes. And he does a bit of statistical analysis where you're looking at, by the time you have 1917, 1918, especially after the spring offensives in March and April 1918, where sort of the Germans take a big baseball bat and give it their best whack before the Americans can start arriving in force. A lot of British divisions kind of get walloped and depleted. However, some don't, and some are able to rebuild. So if you classify those British divisions into sort of, mid, low, and high-end divisions, and then compare them to the Canadian and Australian divisions, or Anzac divisions, excuse me, you get a rough approximation. It's a fairly consistent. If you're looking, he does like wins, losses, and draws, and then also like opposed attacks and unopposed attacks. So especially in opposed attacks, it's about the same. The Canadian divisions would have been considered high-end British divisions, and it's a fair analysis, right? Because I mean, say what you will, but the fact that those British divisions were low-end is because they took the beating in early 1918, which kind of freed up both their higher-end divisions as well as those Dominion and Commonwealth division. What are we going to call them? Nope, still would have been Dominion divisions for later in the war. Mark Humphreys actually goes further. So Mark Humphreys looks at 21 CIB. I can't remember what division that's in, but by comp, I'll say 21 Brigades training plan. So he actually looks at the doctrinal development, and here we are back to doctrine, where, pre-war manuals stressed a lot about fire and movement. In 1916, he looks at, he basically compares the 21st Brigade's training for the Somme and for Vimy, and talks about how basically they're the same. Like, they did exercises, and this is something I didn't know till I did my graduate degree, was that I thought that sort of like every soldier knowing their bit and having full like divisional level rehearsals or formation level rehearsals was new to Vimy. It totally wasn't. They did this stuff in 1916 as well. Humphreys goes as far as to say that the Canadian successes in 1917, 1918, especially in the 100 Days, are primarily just that the British are exhausted. There's actually not that much of a doctrinal difference. It's just the British are kind of on their. We've pushed hard enough. We pushed so long, and they cracked, and we've kind of gained a false positive from doctrinal changes that really weren't that different. I don't. There are problems with that as well, because there really are some significant. There's a whole bunch of new technologies that get incorporated, and I think we missed the point of the learning curve, right? The learning curve isn't just by a whole. It's the riddle of the trenches isn't one intellectual problem. The riddle of the trenches was 100,000 little intellectual and practical problems. So, for example, figuring out exactly how much ammunition you can take with you to capture the enemy's first line of trenches, that you can actually fend off his counterattacks without being too weighed down that gets you caught up. Something like sound ranging, and figuring out weather tables for guns, figuring out barrel wear tables, even, frankly, this is kind of going beyond it, but like you can talk about industrial learning curves, developing a grazing fuse that can actually cut wire. By the way, we're taught on my staff course that you can't use rounds to cut wire because it failed in the First World War. By the end of the First World War, they'd figured out how to cut wire with guns, man. We figured out this problem in 1918, and we've forgotten that we fixed it. Anyway, all of those little problems. So, figuring out all those little problems really does make a difference. And they do incorporate all kinds of new technology. Dan Jenkins, he did an article, I would say, in his work on intelligence gathering in the Canadian Corps. You're figuring out how to incorporate aerial, like air reconnaissance, and you're figuring out different kinds of intelligence. You're able to actually link that intelligence directly under the artillery, because your artillery in the First World War anyway. Don't get any ideas today, gunners. In the First World War, where your primary concern is counter battery, as well as counter mortar and counter machine gun and all that kind of noise. Like figuring out that problem, like how do you transmit intelligence in a timely enough manner? So I don't fully buy Mark Humphrey's argument. No big surprise here, but I buy Doug Delaney's argument. Let's talk about Doug Delaney's take on it. So he talks about mentoring the Canadian, in his article, Mentoring the Canadian Corps, about Imperial staff officers mentoring the Canadian Corps. He talks about basically the development of that nervous system, the staff, the brigade and divisional and corps staffs. At the start of the war, the Canadians get something like 11 PSC qualified officers, so past staff course. We'd also set up, before the war, something called the Militia Staff Course at the good old RMC, where, we actually took a lot of our graduates from Keta and Camberley, as well as British officers on loan. We post them to RMC. 4 out of 10, I think, went to RMC, and we pump militia staff officers through there. So you have this kind of base of knowledge, right? And this actually goes all the way back to the Imperial Conferences of 1904 and 1907 and 1909. When we start making agreements to send people to Camberley, we start agreeing on standard procedures in the British and Dominion armies. And then the eventually creation of the CIGS, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. It goes all the way back to there, right? We have that base. 1914, it isn't just the Canadians that are hurting for staff officers. It's also the British. By 1916, they're implementing a system of formal staff learners, and that takes a while to kind of bite. But the way Delaney explains it is that, by 1917, 1918, you're starting to really see the results, and you're starting to have more qualified officers come through. In fact, the Canadianization of the Canadian Corps only really takes place in early 1918. It happens well after Vimy. And so, having that kind of nervous system that you can actually bolt in those, new technological bits, that's very important, right? And so if you take Delaney's argument a bit further and you kind of combine it with Bill Rawlings' argument, the development of that technician persona with the troops and that that managerial kind of look, managerial, but staff's a bit different than managing. But anyway, those professional staff officers, I think Delaney's focus on people, right? You just have professionals who can sort out these problems, like the development of a doctrine is the important bit. And that's the important distinction between Delaney's argument and Bill Rawlings' argument. So, to conclude, there are two big reasons the Canadian Corps did much better in 1917 and 1918 than they did in, let's say, we'll talk about, and I'll just mention, like, Vimy, Hill 70, and of course, Amiens, not to mention the Cologne Trench Raid that Godfrey mentions. And that's just because no, we had a lot of new technical innovations, especially if you're looking at intelligence like aerial reconnaissance. We have uh, um, gas shells, and boy, Canadians use a lot of gas shells. Um, More than anybody else, by the way. Gas shells are great for counter battery work, right? Because there's nothing that gunners deserve more than a bit of phosgene to mess up their day, right? If you're in a battery and you're trying to lay down defensive fire and you get gassed, two things are going to happen. One, you're going to slow down your rate of fire because you're trying to lift those heavy shells, you're trying to make adjustments, you're trying to talk through your mask, or you'll take your mask off and you'll die, which makes it a lot easier. So you have those kinds of technical developments. Those are actually very important, right? But they don't make a whole lot of sense unless you have the people. You have the best goddamn doctrine in the world, right? And Humphreys points this out. The doctrine didn't change that much, like in its base ideas, but if you don't have the people who can execute that doctrine, it doesn't mean anything. It's a convenient book. So those are the 2 points. That is my argument. If you have any, if you have a different point of view, you should mention it in the comments, and you should use insulting and demeaning language because this is social media.